It began, as strange things often do, in the early hours when the town was still caught between dreams and dawn. The air carried a peculiar stillness, broken only by the rhythmic chirping of crickets. On the edge of town, where old farmland met the first whispers of wilderness, a sharp, deafening crack shattered the calm. Paul Granger, a farmer who prided himself on being up before the sun, was the first to see it. He had been tending to his cows, muttering about a stubborn calf, when he noticed the eerie silence that had settled over the fields. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against his chest. His lantern flickered weakly as if the darkness was swallowing its light. Then he saw it. A massive sinkhole, gaping and unnatural, had carved itself into his pasture overnight. But this was no ordinary sinkhole. Instead of revealing dirt and rock, it unveiled a vast, inverted sky, stretching beneath him as if the earth had turned itself inside out. Clouds drifted lazily through the void, their soft, fluffy forms somehow more unsettling than the emptiness they inhabited. Far above or below, depending on how one viewed it, tiny figures moved, barely discernible against the endless expanse. Paul stumbled backward, the lantern slipping from his hand and sputtering out in the grass. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment he thought he might be having a heart attack. But the sight before him was no hallucination. It was as real as the ground beneath his boots, or what should have been beneath his boots. Hours later, when the sun rose high enough to reveal the scene in stark clarity, Paul was still there, sitting cross-legged near the edge, his gaze fixed on the impossible sky. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he muttered the same words over and over. The sky's falling, but it's not. Word spread quickly, as it always does in small towns. By noon, a crowd had gathered at the Granger farm. Families arrived in pickups and sedans, their curiosity outweighing their unease. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, pointing and whispering, while teenagers snapped photos and recorded videos on their phones. The adults hung back, some crossing themselves, others muttering theories about sinkholes and gas pockets. The sinkhole was larger than anyone had imagined, wider than a football field, and deep enough that no bottom could be seen. The inverted sky stretched on endlessly, clouds drifting in serene defiance of gravity. The distant figures moved with an almost hypnotic grace, their forms too small to make out clearly but unsettling all the same. Kyle Thompson, a brash teenager with a reputation for dares, was the first to test the limits. Egged on by his friends, he picked up a rock and lobbed it into the void. The crowd held its collective breath as the rock tumbled downward, only to slow midair and begin floating upward, as if caught in an invisible current. It drifted higher and higher, vanishing into the clouds. "What the hell?" someone murmured, and a ripple of unease spread through the crowd. The whispers began shortly after. At first, they were faint, barely distinguishable from the rustling wind. But as more people approached the edge, the voices grew louder, forming fragmented words and phrases. Sarah, Lucas, Emily. The names were familiar, and a hush fell over the crowd as recognition dawned. These weren't random murmurs. They were the names of people who had gone missing over the years. A hiker who had vanished in the woods. A runaway teenager last seen near the town limits. A drifter who had been passing through. Paul Granger swore he heard his wife's name. She had died 2 years ago, and now her voice seemed to rise from the depths, soft and beckoning. "Paul, come home." Tensions mounted as the whispers continued. Parents pulled their children close, and some of the braver onlookers retreated to their cars, locking the doors as if that could shield them from the unnatural sound. Then it happened. Benji Carter, a 6-year-old boy with a penchant for wandering, slipped free from his mother's grasp. He darted toward the sinkhole, his small sneakers kicking up dust as he ran. His mother screamed, lunging after him, but she was too late. Benji reached the edge and stumbled, but instead of falling, he floated. The boy's screams pierced the air as he rose upward, his body twisting and turning like a marionette pulled by unseen strings. The crowd watched in horror as he drifted higher, his cries growing fainter until he vanished into the clouds. His mother fell to her knees, clawing at the earth as if she could pull him back. A deep, oppressive silence followed. No one moved. No one spoke. The whispers had stopped, but the weight of what had happened hung in the air, suffocating and absolute. The scientists arrived later that day, armed with equipment and theories. They cordoned off the area, setting up cameras and monitors, but their confidence seemed forced. Even they couldn't explain what they were seeing. The footage from their cameras was distorted, warped as though the sinkhole rejected being recorded. As night fell, the crowd thinned, leaving only Paul Granger sitting near the edge. His lantern, somehow reignited, cast long, flickering shadows over the uneven ground. The whispers returned, louder now, and the figures in the sky seemed closer, their movements deliberate and unsettling. Paul didn't flinch. He simply stared into the abyss, his voice low and steady. "The sky's falling, but it's not." By dawn, the sinkhole had grown. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden collapses or landslides, just a slow, insidious widening, as though the ground itself were surrendering to its pull. The grass at the edges had turned brittle and gray, curling like paper held too close to a flame. Whatever lay beneath the surface wasn't content to stay confined. The whispers, once faint and intermittent, now hummed steadily, filling the air with fragmented phrases and half-heard words. They echoed across the fields, faint enough to make people question if they were hearing things, but persistent enough to gnaw at their minds. The names continued, more missing people, more lost voices. Some residents swore they heard their own names whispered back to them, their own voices calling from the void. The scientists had been working through the night, their makeshift base at the edge of the sinkhole, now buzzing with frantic activity. Dr. Hannah Cho, the lead researcher, stood over a monitor, displaying erratic data streams. Gravity in the vicinity was fluctuating wildly. Objects on their work tables slid unpredictably, pencils lifting off the surface for a moment before clattering down. "It's not just a sinkhole," she muttered, her eyes fixed on the readings. "It's creating its own gravitational field, or warping ours." "What does that mean?" her assistant Eric asked, his voice taut with exhaustion. "It means it's unstable, and it's growing." Across town, the effects were spreading. Buildings on Main Street leaned at odd angles, their foundations cracking under the strain of shifting gravity. Small objects floated intermittently in homes and stores, mugs lifting off tables, picture frames drifting from walls. A delivery truck tilted precariously as one side lifted a few inches off the ground before slamming back down, its tires squealing in protest. In a modest house on Elm Street, Sarah Marlowe sat on the floor of her kitchen, staring at the coffee mug that hovered inches above her countertop. It spun slowly in the air, as though caught in an invisible current. She didn't dare touch it. Her hands trembled in her lap, and her breath came shallow and quick. "It's happening here too," she whispered to herself, her voice breaking. Outside, the air felt heavier, thicker, as though it carried an unseen weight. The hum beneath the earth had grown louder, resonating through the town like a deep, unrelenting drumbeat. It wasn't a sound you heard. It was a sound you felt, vibrating in your bones, making it impossible to relax. At the sinkhole, the scientists attempted to lower a drone into the void. A crowd had gathered again, drawn by a mix of morbid curiosity and desperation for answers. Dr. Cho stood at the edge, directing the operation, her voice clipped and commanding as she relayed instructions to the operator. The drone descended slowly, its camera transmitting a live feed to a nearby monitor. At first, the screen showed only the familiar sight of clouds, soft, white, and drifting in defiance of logic. But as the drone moved deeper, the feed began to warp. The clouds shimmered like disturbed water, and faint shapes emerged in the distance. "What is that?" someone in the crowd whispered. The shapes became clearer. They weren't clouds. They were structures, twisted, impossible versions of buildings spiraling upward into infinity. The outlines of windows and rooftops were visible, but they bent and curved at angles that defied comprehension. It was as though the town itself had been swallowed and reassembled in some grotesque inverted reflection. And then the screen went dark. "Drones offline," the operator said, his voice shaky. Something interfered with the signal. Moments later, the drone reappeared, hurtling upward from the sinkhole as though flung by an unseen hand. It slammed into the ground, its rotors mangled and its camera sparking. The crowd recoiled, but Dr. Cho stepped forward, examining the wreckage with a mix of fascination and dread. "It doesn't want us looking," she said quietly. That evening, the first major event struck. A tremor rippled through the town. Not violent enough to topple buildings, but strong enough to crack pavement and send people stumbling. Near the sinkhole, Paul Granger's barn groaned as its walls bent inward, tilting unnaturally toward the void. Within moments, the entire structure lifted off its foundation, rising a few feet into the air before collapsing into the sinkhole. People screamed as the barn vanished into the inverted sky, its broken timbers tumbling upward into the clouds. The figures in the sky seemed closer now, their movements more deliberate. They didn't resemble humans, not exactly. Too elongated, too fluid. But their presence was undeniable. They were watching. Later that night, a local teenager named Dana Wallace vanished. Her parents had begged her to stay inside, but curiosity had drawn her to the sinkhole. Witnesses claimed she had been standing near the edge, staring into the void, when her body began to rise. Her screams echoed through the night as she floated upward, her silhouette disappearing into the clouds. The crowd that had gathered earlier was gone now. No one dared approach the sinkhole after dark. Not after Dana, not after the barn. Even the scientists retreated to their makeshift camp, though they left sensors and cameras in place to continue gathering data. Inside her tent, Dr. Cho sat with her head in her hands. The whispers were louder now, seeping into every corner of her mind. "It's not just the sinkhole," she muttered to herself. "It's the sky, the ground, everything. It's changing." Outside, the pulsing hum grew louder, vibrating through the earth and air. And for the first time, the figures in the inverted sky began to descend. By the next morning, the town was unrecognizable. The sinkhole had expanded to twice its original size, its edges now creeping hungrily toward the road that once led to Paul Granger's farmhouse. The fields that surrounded the sinkhole were barren, the grass brittle and blackened as though scorched by some invisible fire. The barn was no more, its absence marked only by a jagged patch of disturbed earth. For anyone who ventured close, it felt as though the land itself had been hollowed out, the air heavy with something beyond comprehension. Buildings throughout the town leaned at impossible angles, their frames groaning under the weight of shifting gravity. Plaster cracked, windows shattered, and beams creaked as though protesting the very laws of physics being rewritten. The streets had twisted into grotesque spirals, asphalt splitting into jagged shards that clawed at the sky. What few cars remained appeared frozen in a silent chaos, some perched precariously on two wheels, others sunken into depressions that hadn't existed the day before. A school bus lay on its side in the middle of Main Street, its bright yellow paint flecked with eerie scorch marks. But it was the sky, or what remained of it, that struck the deepest chord of terror. The inverted expanse beneath the ground had spread, now reaching into the heavens above, creating an endless horizon of mirrored clouds. The illusion made it impossible to tell where the ground ended and the sky began. The figures, once distant and hazy, were now sharp and unmistakably present. They didn't walk, didn't fly. They glided forward with an unnerving grace, their elongated limbs and translucent forms shimmering as though caught between existence and nothingness. Their movements were hypnotic, deliberate, as if they were studying their prey. Inside the town's small church, a group of survivors had taken refuge. The air inside was heavy with desperation, the thick scent of sweat and fear mingling with the faint odor of burnt wood from candles hastily lit the night before. Father Peter stood at the front, gripping his rosary so tightly that the metal of the crucifix dug into his palm, leaving faint indentations. His once booming voice was reduced to a shaky murmur. "We must pray," he said, his tone pleading more than commanding. "This is a test, a trial. We must keep faith." Margaret, a sharp-tongued widow sitting in the front pew, scoffed loudly. "What faith, Father? You think God did this? You think this is his way of punishing us?" Before Peter could muster a response, a loud crack split the air like a gunshot. The entire congregation froze, eyes darting toward the back of the church. The wooden pews groaned, the polished wood warping as they tilted toward the altar. Above them, the heavy chandelier swayed violently, its crystals casting jagged patterns of light across the walls. Then, impossibly, the entire back wall began to rise. At first it lifted slowly, as though testing its limits, but soon the movement became deliberate, almost forceful. The wood groaned and splintered, fragments breaking off and tumbling upward into the air. A woman screamed as the wall separated completely, drifting upward in jagged pieces like leaves caught in an updraft. The chandelier followed, its ornate crystals scattering light in a dizzying display as it spiraled into the inverted sky, disappearing into the mirrored clouds. "Run!" someone shouted, breaking the congregation's paralysis. The survivors scrambled toward the doors, shoving one another in their desperation to escape. Outside, they were greeted by an even more horrifying sight. The buildings around them were succumbing one by one. A hardware store floated free of its foundation, its neon open sign flickering erratically as it spiraled upward. Pieces of the town, its history, its identity, were being torn away as if they'd never existed. A small diner vanished in a cascade of plates and chairs, the scent of stale coffee lingering in its wake. Even the street lamps were not immune, their bases creaking and snapping as they tilted toward the sinkhole, pulled into the endless void. At the edge of the sinkhole, Dr. Hannah Cho stood with the last two members of her team. Eric was gone, pulled into the sky the night before while attempting to retrieve a malfunctioning sensor. Clara, the youngest of the team, clutched a clipboard as if it could shield her from the horrors unfolding around them. The third assistant, Mark, was silent, his face pale and haunted, his eyes darting to the sinkhole every few seconds. "The expansion is accelerating," Dr. Cho muttered, barely audible over the deafening roar that now emanated from the sinkhole. She stared at her tablet, the screen flickering as it struggled to make sense of the data streaming in. The gravity distortions were no longer isolated. They were spreading, a ripple of chaos extending outward from the sinkhole's center. It's not just the sinkhole anymore. The entire area is destabilizing. "What does that mean?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. She clutched the clipboard tighter, her knuckles white against the wood. Dr. Cho hesitated, her lips pressed into a thin line as she glanced toward the sinkhole. The figures were closer now, their elongated forms shifting and bending as though they were testing the boundaries of reality. "It means—" She trailed off, unable to find words for the enormity of what she was seeing. "It means we're running out of time." The hum beneath the earth had transformed into a roar, a deep, resonant vibration that shook the ground, sending waves of force rippling through the air. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, a physical weight that pressed against their chests and made it hard to breathe. People covered their ears, but the roar was inside them, thrumming in their bones, pounding behind their eyes. The first of the figures crossed the threshold of the sinkhole. It moved slowly, its towering form shimmering like heat rising from asphalt. Its limbs stretched impossibly long, its surface rippling like liquid silver. The air around it distorted, bending light and sound as it moved closer to the edge. Dr. Cho took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. "We need to leave, now." Clara hesitated, her eyes fixed on the figure. "But where can we go?" Dr. Cho didn't answer. She didn't know. And as the figure raised what might have been a hand, reaching toward the remaining fragments of the town, she realized there might not be anywhere left to go. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the town was gone. The sinkhole had expanded to cover everything, leaving behind only a smooth, featureless expanse. The earth that once supported homes, roads, and memories was now an inverted sky, an endless stretch of clouds, serene and haunting in their stillness. The figures, once a distant presence, now moved lazily across the expanse, their forms shimmering and blending into the horizon like phantoms of a forgotten dream. They no longer seemed confined to the inverted world below. Instead, they loomed larger, as if their influence was spreading, as if they were growing stronger. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with the weight of what had been lost. There were no echoes of laughter, no distant hum of cars, no rustle of leaves in the wind. The town had been erased, its very essence absorbed into the void, leaving only the oppressive quiet and the endless mirrored sky. But the world didn't stop for the absence of one small town. Far away, in another quiet corner of the world, the air held an uncanny stillness. A soft breeze rustled through a field of tall grass, its rhythm natural and undisturbed. The sky was clear, the sun warm, and the horizon stretched out in peaceful monotony. Yet beneath the earth, something stirred. The first crack was faint, a soft pop, like a stone settling in loose soil. Then came another, louder, followed by a deep groan as the ground began to shift. The cracks multiplied, spreading like jagged lightning across the surface. Grass and soil crumbled, tumbling inward as a new sinkhole began to form. Within moments, the roar of the earth split the air, shattering the tranquility. The ground collapsed, falling away piece by piece to reveal the same unnerving expanse of inverted sky. Clouds drifted in lazy spirals, illuminated by a faint, unnatural glow. The mist began to rise, curling upward, like the breath of a slumbering beast. For a long moment, all was still, save for the faint hum that began to pulse from the edges of the new abyss. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily louder, vibrating through the ground, shaking the air itself. A ripple passed through the real sky above, bending light in strange, distorted patterns, as though the two skies, the one above and the one below, were beginning to merge. And then, faintly at first, but unmistakable, came the whispers, fragmented words carried on the hum, pulling at the edges of comprehension. Come closer, we see you. In the distance, the first figures began to form. They moved slowly, their shapes indistinct but purposeful, gliding through the inverted sky toward the new sinkhole. The horizon shimmered as their forms took shape, growing clearer with every moment. They were coming. The cycle had begun again.